May 23, 1994 was a day of panic in the normally peaceful suburbs of Rochester, New York. A 4-year-old girl was riding her big-wheeled tricycle around her apartment complex in the tiny village of East Rochester, New York. Her mom was just inside the door, preparing magazines she was delivering for a second job that night. Multitasking between getting the inserts into the magazines to prep for her shift that night and looking up to keep an eye on her daughter, the mother finished her task within minutes. She grabbed what she needed to go outside and load up the car and tell her daughter it was time to go. But when she got out there, she was gone. The disappearance of Kaylee Ann Poulton was on both local and national news, gripping the community with fear. That search ended in sorrow in August of 1996 with a confession from a former neighbor. He had murdered Kaylee Ann on the day she went missing. Little did the community know that on the very same day, likely within just a few hours of Kaylee Ann's abduction and just 12 miles to the east, a 38-year-old pregnant woman would vanish along with her beloved dog. Her case has many unanswered questions, including any indication of her whereabouts or what happened to her that fateful spring afternoon. Her case underlines the sad reality that the most joyous time in a woman's life can also be the most dangerous. This is A Simpler Time True Crime, the mysterious disappearance of Sandra Sollie. Sandra Ann Sollie was born December 10, 1955, to Dominic and Nancy Cervone. Her family was a close-knit Italian Catholic family. Her mother, Nancy, had been born in Italy and moved to the United States early in life. Her father, Dominic, lived in the Western New York area all of his life. He served in the U.S. Army in World War II, and after his military service, he started his family with Nancy and provided for them as a construction worker with the Rochester Labor Union, which he did up until his retirement. Sandra, who usually went by Sandy, had 3 brothers and a sister. The family lived in Oakfield, New York, which is about a 40-minute drive west of Rochester, New York, and almost the exact midpoint between Rochester and Buffalo if you took some back roads before hopping on the thruway. Sandra was described as very friendly and chatty, a bubbly disposition you can almost see just from her pictures. It just sort of jumps out at you. Sandra married a man named Ralph Sollie Jr. and moved to Macedon, New York. Macedon is 20 miles southeast of Rochester and about an hour's drive to her family in Oakfield. Sandra and Ralph would be married for nearly 8 years before deciding to get a divorce. They never had any children together during their marriage, and Ralph went on to marry and have children shortly thereafter. Many sources cite Ralph's next wife to be none other than Sandra's former hairdresser. So that probably made things a little bit uncomfortable. Nevertheless, Sandra had made herself a new life out on this side of town and decided to stay in the area. She was working for Eastman Kodak Company and rented out a duplex on Route 350 in Macedon. I'll include a picture of the duplex she lived in on our Instagram page, @SimplerTimeCrimePod. Being social and extroverted, Sandra was known to go out a lot in the years following her divorce. She liked to go out to bars and meet up with friends and had casually dated people. But that all changed at the end of 1993 when Sandra found out that she was expecting her first child. Sandra was so excited. At age 38 and single, she had somewhat come to terms with the fact that having children might not be in the cards for her. While unplanned, this pregnancy was something she had always wanted, and friends and family members described how she completely overhauled her life. She stopped going out to bars, smoking cigarettes, and was cautious about the company she kept. She shifted her focus and poured all of her energy into preparing for the birth of her baby. One of her friends described her as a homebody at this point who just mainly went to Catholic Mass and ran around for a few errands. By May 23, 1994, Sandra was around 7 months pregnant. Her apartment had all the telltale signs of a parent excited to welcome their baby. Her calendar had prenatal appointment visits scribbled all over it, the nursery was partially decorated, and the baby's dresser was filled with neatly washed and folded baby clothes. Baby boy clothes, that is. Sandra had found out the sex of her baby, a son she planned to name Brandon Michael. Her baby shower was in a couple weeks, but as most parents can relate, she was too excited not to get some things on her own too. Carefully curated outfits, colors, and cozy things. May 23, 1994 was a Monday, and Sandra had a busy day of errands to run ahead of her. In what's maybe the sweetest friendship of all time, Sandra had become close friends with a fellow Macedon man named Ed Miller. Ed was an 84-year-old widower whose wife had died over 20 years prior. With eyesight that had declined, he'd given up his driver's license several years prior. After meeting Sandra, the two hit it off, and this unlikely friendship got them together rather frequently. She would pick him up for company and take him on errands just so he could come along for the ride. Sometimes she'd bring him for things he needed as well, like groceries and prescriptions. This Monday was no different, and Ed's account of the day helped establish a timeline of Sandra's movements. This would be essential in a case that is plagued with such little concrete information. Here is what information we do know about that day. At 10 a.m., Sandra phoned a friend to tell her she had a bunch of errands to run that day. She also told her friend that she planned to meet her ex-husband Ralph later that afternoon. At 11 o'clock a.m., she called Ed Miller to see if he wanted to run along on some errands with her. According to Ed, their first stop was out to Newark, New York, to pick up a prescription. Newark is about 12 miles east of Macedon. They then stopped at a thrift shop to look for some secondhand clothes. Once they finished shopping, Ed treated Sandra to lunch at the Perkins restaurant in Newark. In an article to the Wayne County Times, he said, quote, "She never had much money, so I didn't mind buying her lunch," end quote. One reason for this was that Sandra was currently on disability and unable to work her job at Eastman Kodak. She reportedly suffered a head injury and was having recurrent headaches. This limited her income significantly. After lunch, she dropped Ed back to his house between 1:45 to 2 o'clock p.m. She also told Ed that day about her plans to meet up with Ralph that afternoon. Between 2 o'clock and 2:30 p.m. that day, Sandra shopped at the Ames department store in West Wayne Plaza on Route 31 in Macedon. We can verify this sighting because she bumped into a friend in the arts and crafts section. According to this anonymous friend, Sandra was shopping for some items for the baby's room. They chatted for a few minutes before Sandra abruptly cut their conversation short, rushing to check out because she had told this friend she had to go meet up with her ex-husband. This is the last confirmed sighting of Sandra. Ed grew concerned the following morning when he didn't get his daily phone call he was expecting from her. He reached out to her and didn't get a response, which was very out of character. Ed shared that Sandra always returned his calls. By Wednesday, he grew concerned and phoned police, but they didn't share his concern and wouldn't act on it. In their opinion, it wasn't a police matter when a friend just didn't return your calls for a couple of days. However, by June 2nd, her landlord had stopped by. Sandra was always incredibly timely with her rent payment, and even being a day late was enough of a concern to the landlord that he wanted to do a welfare check. He showed up to Sandra's duplex and noticed her Honda parked in the driveway. He knocked at the door and got no reply. There was just an eerie silence on the property, and this prompted him to call the police. A family member of Sandra's actually called police on the same day because she had uncharacteristically missed some prenatal appointments. Police did respond to the scene, but didn't find anything too out of the ordinary. Sandra's car was in her driveway, the apartment was locked up, Her dog's bowl was filled with food, and there was no sign of a struggle in her apartment. The only thing missing was Sandra, her 6-year-old black poodle named Jessie, and her purse. At this point, the police told concerned friends and loved ones to give it a few more days and to be back in touch if she didn't reach out. A few days later, Sandra's duplex neighbor phoned police to say she still hadn't returned, and an official missing persons report was filed. I want to speak to this delay for a moment. Going back to the tragic story I opened this episode with, her disappearance on the same day as Kaylee Ann Poulton is commonly shared as the reason why her case was glossed over in the media. In fact, almost any article you read on Sandra will mention some variation of this. But I don't know that it's fair to say that. The greater Rochester community, including its media outlets, was not even aware of Sandra's disappearance until into the first week of June. At that time, the coverage did still pale in comparison to the coverage of the preschooler who was abducted from her front yard. But I personally hate the messaging and implications with this. Kaylee Ann's family did not get any special silver lining for having more media coverage. They didn't get a happy ending. In fact, media coverage didn't solve her case at all. A mom's intuition and a killer's confession did. Comparing the two cases to go tit for tat about media coverage and community sympathy symbolically places two victims of crimes against each other, rather than focusing on the bigger issues at play. Both of these victims, though different in age, circumstance, and location, encountered evil on that warm spring day, and those perpetrators of evil are the real enemy here. Having said all of that, Sandra's case is lacking resolution, and it does deserve as much coverage as possible, which is why I choose to feature it. The police delay is something that failed Sandra from day one. I'm sure that police get a lot of cases of missing people who mainly show up quickly and either just needed some time away or there was just a miscommunication. There are statistics that back this up. I'm also aware that when triaging these situations, police officers are positioned to have to make a judgment call. But I also think police can develop a bias from previous outcomes that shields them from listening to people who know the victim best. Ed Miller, Sandra's close friend, knew something was up by the next day. Her doctors were alarmed at her missing prenatal appointments. Her family had not heard from her when she was supposed to be making plans for her baby shower. She didn't pay her rent. When you have multiple people from different parts of a person's life all coming to you and saying something isn't right, you should listen. The delay in her missing persons report was an oversight, to put it lightly. But police did work to redeem themselves when they jumped into action. They began interviewing people who had seen her that day, along with others who were closest to her. As I said earlier, Sandra told 3 different people that day that she planned to meet her ex-husband, Ralph Sollie, that afternoon. But what police found out next would change the direction of their investigation. You see, she wasn't just meeting Ralph to discuss business related to their divorce. She had told many friends and family members in her life that she had been having an affair with her ex-husband, and that he was the father of baby Brandon. You heard that right. Her ex-husband, who was now remarried with a whole new family. That afternoon, she planned to discuss child support with him, even though his family was unaware of the alleged affair. This bombshell made Ralph jump to the top of police's list of people they wanted to talk to. Initially, Ralph cooperated with investigators. Per Ralph's own statement to media, he provided police his telephone and bank records and 2 interviews. He also confidently conveyed that he has alibis for each and every hour of that day. Here's the thing. Police have never named Ralph Sollie, or anybody for that matter, an official suspect. This is one of those cases where there are just very few people to actually talk about. but police have gone as far as to say that they have eliminated some people they initially considered persons of interest, and Ralph Sollie is not amongst them. If what Ralph is saying is true, and he truly has an airtight alibi, wouldn't you think the police would come forth and say that and clear him publicly? Beyond that, some of Ralph's comments to journalists are, well, just kind of off. In the Wayne County Times article published a year after Sandra's disappearance, Ralph denied planning to meet Sandra that day and said he believed the last time he saw her was the Friday before her disappearance. He denied having an affair with her and denied being the father of her unborn child. When asked about the divorce, he said that it was, quote, because she lived a different lifestyle that didn't fit mine. That was something I wanted to put behind me, end quote. When discussing the rumors circulating about their affair and the baby, he said he was, quote, I'm not surprised, with the types of friends she had, that these rumors are being spread. He added, quote, I was just embarrassed to be associated with her, end quote. Now, I understand divorces can be tumultuous and ugly, but if your pregnant ex-wife suddenly vanished without a trace, with evidence that indicates something terrible likely befell her, and you had nothing to do with those circumstances, don't you think this would be the one instance you could sort of, I don't know, table those feelings of disdain and share sentiments of concern or sadness for the tragedy? It's also a bit strange that he is denying any plan for a meetup. Sandra casually mentioned this plan to 3 different people who had no contact with each other to cook up any story. Why would she make that up? After the initial interviews, Ralph stopped cooperating with police on the advice of his attorney. He refused to take a polygraph test and did not allow police to search his property or belongings. Shortly after police began investigating, they did get a couple of breaks in the form of physical evidence. A man was rifling through dumpsters along Panorama Trail in Penfield, New York, 13 miles west of Sandra's home in the direction towards Rochester, New York. When he got to one behind a car wash, he found Sandra's purse as well as Jesse's dog collar and tags. One could speculate that if someone had harmed Sandra and her dog, they could have cleaned out their car after this at the car wash and used the dumpster to dispose of evidence. Nowadays, most businesses like this one have video surveillance. Police could have painstakingly gone through it to see who had come and put items in the dumpster. While not a guaranteed home run, it's something available today that wasn't then. While there was some video surveillance in parts of places in 1994, it was much less common, and this wasn't an option for investigators. One thing I want to mention is that there are some discrepancies about Sandra's purse in various reporting. Like major discrepancies in what's one of the only pieces of evidence. Some sources state that Sandra's purse was found back at her apartment. More sources state that at least parts of her purse were found at this dumpster. Some sources clarify that the man who found the dog tags and leash in the dumpster had previously seen the purse but discarded it after rummaging through it. Without investigative notes in front of me, which I don't have access to, I don't know what the accurate answer is. The next break came when Sandra's credit cards racked up $1,500 in purchases. Investigators were able to track the spending and find the culprits. What they found was that a 9-year-old boy had found Sandra's wallet and credit cards in some shrubs and bushes towards the corner of Reed Park and North Avenue in Rochester, New York. I'll share a Google Maps photo of this area on our Instagram. Police were able to determine that this child brought the wallet home to his mother and boyfriend, and the boyfriend then used this card for purchases along with a few people in the area. Police were able to determine then that they used these cards at a time of opportunity and were not at all involved in the crime. So then, why were these items there? People in the community at large were beginning to take this evidence and think that it was staged to throw off investigators. In 1996, a private investigator was watching TV when he saw a news segment about Sandra's case. The sadness of the family and the blip of coverage moved him to want to do something to help her grief-stricken parents. Richard Ingram, who was in his 60s at the time, called them up to see if they would be interested in his investigative skills and what he could throw at the case. Within a few days, Richard was in the Oakfield home of Dominic and Nancy Cervone, and he took on their case for $1. Richard has been a force to be reckoned with for this case and made it his mission to find answers for Sandra's family ever since. He has kept open tip lines, done interviews, and held annual vigil at West Wayne Plaza on the anniversary of her disappearance. He has worked cooperatively with police on this case, always turning over any leads or information he finds, and is careful not to publicly comment on anything that could jeopardize the investigation. Police and PIs, as we know, do not always play nice in the sandbox together, but in this case, Richard seems to be incredibly respectful and boundary-driven in his approach. He's even tapped into some strategies that are unconventional for him, like utilizing a well-known psychic. Ingram hasn't shared much about what the psychic conveyed, just that Sandra was near or in water. But there was one tip Richard Ingram received in 2007 that stood out above all the rest. A little after 2 p.m. on May 30th, Richard received a phone call from a man who sounded nervous. He talked so fast and had such an anxious tone, Richard didn't even have time to grab a pen to write down what he was saying. The man stated that he knew a man in Palmyra, the town neighboring Macedon, who had first-hand information about who killed Sandra Sollie. Ingram shared, quote, "He said, 'I'm only going to say this once. I know a guy who knows who killed her,' end quote." The man hung up before Richard could ask any follow-up questions. Ever since that day, Richard has pled for this person to come back with the information he has. The last major movement in the case happened back in late October 2016. Ralph Sollie sold his property to new owners, who permitted police to search the property on Weidrick Road in Macedon. New York State Trooper Mark O'Donnell said in an article to the Democrat and Chronicle, quote, "There wasn't anything in particular that led us out there other than this is where she was last seen before she went missing. We want closure for her family, and we want to bring this case to a successful conclusion. When we have a missing person, we continue to look for the person until we locate them," end quote. 6 K-9 units and 4 divers searched the property, which had a pond on it. The pond had a max depth of between 5.5 to 6 feet in parts. From what's been released to the media, nothing of evidentiary value was found in the search, but it is possible that police just aren't releasing anything. Because we have very few other clues around Sandra's disappearance, there is space left to speculate. But being that Sandra was pregnant at the time of her disappearance, it's worth discussing a terrifying fact that many people don't realize. According to a 2022 article in the BMJ, a peer-reviewed medical journal, homicide is the leading cause of death during pregnancy and the postpartum period in the U.S. Let that sink in. This surpasses the other top 3, which include bleeding, high blood pressure, and sepsis. Statistically, most homicides are intimate partner violence related and have a gun involved. The study found that pregnancy-associated deaths accounted for more than 20% of all the homicides of female victims reported to the CDC between 2008 and 2019. According to a Healthline article that summarized the study, non-Hispanic Black or African American individuals were more likely than white or Hispanic people to be murdered during pregnancy or shortly after childbirth. Black and African American people make up only 14% of the country's population, but accounted for almost 40% of pregnancy-associated homicides. Just recently, in December of 2023, Idaho woman Kaylee Randall Best was shot and killed by her husband Jeremy. She was 6 months pregnant. In another case in December of 2023, New Hampshire woman Christine Falzone was around 37 weeks pregnant when William Kelly, whom she resided with, beat her and her unborn child to death. In November of 2022, 18-year-old Kaylin Fiengo was shot and killed in a vehicle in Sanford, Florida. She had been arguing with the baby's father, Donovan Faison, about her pregnancy when he allegedly opened fire. These are just 3 cases that happened in recent years. It's not even the tip of the iceberg. For pregnancy-related homicides, obstetric healthcare workers have received ongoing training on how to be a safe resource for patients, including ensuring that there are appointments with just the pregnant person without their partner present. In a 2001 editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Victoria Fry writes, quote, "Homicide by intimate partners may offer a focal point for effective pregnancy-associated mortality prevention efforts because many of these women come into contact with the healthcare system before their deaths," end quote. Whether or not Sandra Sollie was the victim of violence related to her pregnancy is still something we are waiting for answers on, along with a multitude of other unknowns. It's something her parents both went to their graves not having the answers to. Both parents were close with Sandra, but her mom, Nancy, was incredibly devastated by everything that occurred. Sandra's disappearance affected both of her parents intensely, but she was particularly close with her mother and shared a really tight bond. In an article published around Thanksgiving time the year she went missing, Nancy said, quote, "She used to come over and help prepare the meal. She was so happy. Everybody tells me that she's like me. Now that's gone. That's all gone." End quote. She added, quote, "I always keep repeating they never found her body. I just can't sleep thinking about it." Eventually, Sandra's mother had to stop participating in media interviews because it became too difficult for her. Richard Ingram is in his 90s now and still hopes to have answers in his lifetime. In a 2022 interview by Spectrum News, he said, quote, "We've covered a lot of leads, and I've tried to keep this thing going, to keep it alive. That's why I'm doing this, but it's so cold. It's just about frozen over. I don't have much support. That's all right. I don't need anybody. I promised I'd do this. That's what I'm doing." Based on the call to Richard Ingram in 2007, we know that whoever committed this crime told somebody. If you were the person who placed that call, please find it in your heart to share that information again. It was clearly weighing on you then, and that couldn't have gotten any easier with this passage of time. This May 23rd, 2024 marks 30 years since Sandra, baby Brandon, and Jesse went missing. Sandra has siblings and nieces and nephews who are waiting for answers and have waited long enough. If you have any information on the disappearance of Sandra Sollie, please reach out to the New York State Police Troop E Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Canandaigua, New York. They can be reached at 585-398-3200. That's 585-398-3200. You can also email the information to nysvicap@troopers.ny.gov. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram @SimplerTimeCrimePod. Thank you for listening.